Before we begin this true and moving story, I ask that you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This is crucial so that more people receive heart-touching narratives and life lessons. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, but proof of how fate can change the course of a life in a matter of seconds. Get ready because Pedro and Camila will be moved. Pedro and Camila met unexpectedly in a simple encounter that forever changed their lives. From the first glance, it seemed as if something greater had united them. Their courtship was brief, intense, and soon they decided to marry. They had no wealth, but they carried within them one certainty. The love they felt was enough to face anything together. Pedro's smile filled Camila's heart. Newlyweds, they lived a phase of enchantment, as if every detail were magical. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, a walk hand in hand in the afternoon, or even late night conversations. These were simple moments, but they brought immense happiness. Their home was small, but filled with warmth and dreams that extended beyond the walls. Everything seemed perfect, and the future promising. Pedro had a special routine that was part of his daily routine. Walking his dog early in the morning, he said that this moment was his way to give thanks for life and organize his thoughts. Camila laughed, thought it was cute, and sometimes watched him from the window as he walked out with the dog, wagging its tail excitedly. To her, Pedro was more than a husband. He was a loyal companion with whom she dreamed of growing old. Camila, for her part, devoted herself to the home and their new plans for their life together. She enjoyed making breakfast, organizing the house, and thinking about the future they were building together. They talked about children, traveling, and even buying a small house in the countryside. These were simple dreams, but filled with meaning. Their love didn't need grandiose things to blossom. Each other's presence was enough. But fate often likes to test the strength of even the purest dreams. While Pedro and Camila believed they had their whole lives ahead of them, a silent shadow approached. There were still no signs of what was to come, but something big was preparing to cross their path. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The days passed at a serene pace, and every moment together felt like a gift. Camila looked at Pedro and saw in him the fulfillment of everything she'd ever dreamed of in a partner: kindness, joy, and courage. Pedro, meanwhile, said that Camila was his strength, the one who made him believe in himself and keep going. Their love was so evident that even their friends commented on how inseparable they were. There was genuine intensity in every gesture. When Pedro arrived home, Camila's tight hug seemed to cure any tiredness. On weekends, they enjoyed cooking together, listening to music, and planning their next conquests. They laughed at silly things and cried at romantic movies. They were partners in everything, living a phase where life felt like an eternal honeymoon. The dog, always present, completed the family scene. He ran around the house, making people laugh, and was often the reason Pedro got up early and left the house excited. Camila joked that the animal was like a son to them both, and Pedro agreed. Every detail of their daily life further reinforced the idea that they were made for each other. Neighbors often said that Pedro and Camila were a couple straight out of a soap opera, young, in love, and full of hope. They knew life wouldn't be perfect, but they believed that together they could overcome any challenge. For them, the future looked promising, full of new stories and achievements to celebrate together. Camila, in her quiet moments, thanked God for that gift. She knew true love was rare, and she felt blessed to have found it so early. She harbored a secret fear of losing that happiness, but she never let that thought overwhelm her. She preferred to believe that nothing could break the strength of what they had built together, but life has a harsh way of reminding us of our fragility. While Pedro and Camila lived days filled with laughter and complicity, fate was already preparing an unexpected twist, something that would come not to destroy their love, but to test the limits of a heart's endurance. What was approaching could not have been predicted, and when it arrived, it would change everything forever. Pedro walked calmly with his dog along the sidewalk, thinking about the life he was building with Camila. His heart was light, and he smiled as he watched the dog running happily beside him. On the other side of the avenue, the crosswalk seemed safe, and Pedro took a deep breath before crossing. The sunny day reinforced the feeling of peace, as if nothing could go wrong. But in a matter of seconds, everything would change drastically. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires broke the silence. A car sped by, ignoring the red light and barreling into the lane. Pedro, with no time to react, tried to pull the dog closer, but it was too late. The vehicle hit the dog first, which was in front. The impact was so violent that the dog's body cushioned the force that would have hit Pedro. It was a heartbreaking scene. Pedro fell to the ground violently, his head hitting the asphalt, knocking him unconscious. But strange as it seemed, the dog's involuntary sacrifice saved his life. People around him ran in despair, screaming for help. The driver, in shock, got out of the car trembling, but nothing could erase the tragedy that had just occurred. The animal remained motionless, while blood spread across the street. A painful silence fell over the scene. Some tried to revive Pedro, while others approached the lifeless puppy. Tears welled up in the eyes of those watching, for it was impossible not to be moved. Their faithful companion had departed brutally, but he had also been the barrier that prevented Pedro from being taken away immediately. It was as if the animal had given its own life to save its owner. Meanwhile, Camila was preparing lunch at home, oblivious to what was happening. "Your husband run over. Come quickly." From that moment, the fear of the worst was unbearable, but the flame of hope still burned within her. What she didn't know was that, in addition to fighting for her husband's life, she would also have to deal with the irreparable pain of losing a companion who had left to protect him. Camila arrived at the hospital heartbroken. On the way, she had already learned from neighbors that her puppy had succumbed to the impact. The pain of losing her faithful companion was immense, but the greatest anguish was seeing Pedro fighting for his life. Upon entering the emergency room, she saw her husband unconscious, surrounded by doctors and equipment. Her breath caught in her throat as if the world were crumbling before her eyes. Pedro's body lay motionless, with tubes and sensors everywhere. Camila ran to the stretcher but was stopped by nurses who told her to wait. She screamed, cried, called her husband's name as if the power of love could bring him back. Deep down, she still felt the loss of her dog, but her instincts told her that at that moment, she needed to fight only for Pedro. It was a despair that seemed endless. The attending physician approached, his expression grave. "He suffered severe head trauma. He's fallen into a coma. We don't know when or if he'll wake up." The words pierced Camila's heart like sharp blades. Time stood still. The newlywed who dreamed of travel and plans now faced a future of uncertainty and pain. She could barely stand. With each passing day, Camila remained by his bedside, holding her husband's cold hand. She remembered the memories of the past few months, the smiles and plans so suddenly interrupted. She talked to him even without a response, believing that somewhere Pedro was listening. The hospital became her home, and hope was the only thing keeping her going. Still, the silence in the room was deafening. Sometimes Camila cried, remembering the dog. He had been an unwitting hero, giving his life to save Pedro. This mixture of pain and gratitude tore her apart. "I lost our friend, but I won't lose you," she whispered to her comatose husband. She clung to her faith, asking God for a second chance. Nothing seemed to matter more than seeing him open his eyes again. The doctors were cautious. They said his condition was serious and that the next few hours would be decisive. Camila, however, refused to believe such dire predictions. Her love was greater than any diagnosis. Her heart told her that Pedro would return, but she also sensed that something very strange would happen when that finally happened. And she wasn't wrong. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. Camila didn't leave the hospital even when everyone urged her to rest. Her face was already tired, her eyes red from crying, but the strength of her love wouldn't allow her to abandon her husband. Every small movement in Pedro's body was a spark of hope for her. The constant beeping of the machine became her soundtrack. She brought photographs, played Pedro's favorite songs, and told stories about their lives. "You promised you'd never leave me," she whispered in his ear, as if her voice could penetrate the barrier of his coma. Doctors and nurses looked on with compassion, admiring the woman's strength, but deep down, many no longer believed in such a miraculous recovery. Camila, however, refused to give up. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the silent room, she relived the scene of the accident, the screeching of the tires, the dog's desperate barking, Pedro's body falling to the pavement. The pain returned like a stab, reminding her of the fragility of life. Camila felt torn, part of her still mourning the loss of her pet, and the other fighting with all her might to save her husband. Even in the darkest moments, faith was her strength. With the Bible in her hands, she prayed for strength and believed in a miracle. "Like, God, don't take him away from me now," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. Each word was filled with desperation and love, and although no one guaranteed Pedro would awaken, Camila believed it would. It was only a matter of time. Some family members suggested she accept the possibility of a life without Pedro, but Camila rejected any such thought. "He'll come back, I know he will," she said firmly, as if her voice could shape the future. This certainty kept her alive amidst the chaos. Every day she waited for a sign, a gesture, anything that would confirm her faith. Then, in a silent dawn, the unexpected happened. A gentle movement in Pedro's fingers made Camilla jump from her chair. Her heart raced, and tears came before she could even speak. It was as if time had stopped for that very moment. Peter was returning, but what seemed like the beginning of victory would soon become an even greater nightmare. Pedro's eyes opened slowly, as if awakening from a long nightmare. Camilla, overcome with emotion, held his hand and cried, unable to speak. "Thank God you're back," she said through her tears. The room seemed to fill with light, and for the first time in weeks, she felt everything make sense again. But in the next instant, something unexpected happened. Pedro stared at Camilla, his expression confused. His eyes blinked rapidly as if trying to recognize who was standing before him. "Who are you?" he asked in a weak but firm voice. His words chilled Camilla's blood. She laughed nervously, believing it was just disorientation. She leaned closer and replied, "It's me, love. Your wife." But his reaction was even crueler. "Wife? I'm not married. I don't know you," Pedro said, pushing her hand away. Camilla felt the ground disappear beneath her. The tears that had once been of joy turned to despair. It was as if a stranger were occupying the body of the man she loved. The impact of those words was more devastating than the accident itself. Doctors were rushed in, and after quick examinations, they explained the blow to the head had caused severe amnesia. Pedro remembered nothing from the last few years of his life. This could be temporary, they said, trying to ease Camilla's pain. But for her, nothing seemed temporary. She felt as if she had lost her husband, even though he was right there in front of her. Camilla tried to compose herself, taking his hand again. "I'm Camilla. We got married recently. You proposed to me in the park, remember?" But Pedro just stared at her silently, as if she were a complete stranger. The emptiness in his gaze destroyed any immediate hope. The love of her life was there, but he didn't recognize her. Between sobs, Camilla realized the fight was just beginning. It wouldn't be against the coma anymore, but against the absence of memory, against the indifference of a heart that had once been hers. And deep down, something told her that getting Pedro back would be much harder than having him back from death. The real drama had just begun. Pedro's eyes opened slowly, as if emerging from a long, deep sleep. Camilla, overcome with emotion, held his hand and couldn't hold back her tears. "Thank God you're back," she said, her voice breaking. The room seemed flooded with a faint light, and in that moment, everything seemed to make sense again. But soon a strange uneasiness took hold of Pedro. He looked around with a confused expression, moving his head slowly. His eyes searched for faces, but there was a glint of uncertainty in his gaze. He mumbled disjointed words, trying to make sense of what he saw. "Home. I don't know. You," he said in a fragile, hesitant tone. Camilla squeezed his hand, trying to convey reassurance. But his confusion tore at her heart. Pedro seemed to be trying to remember, but his mind was a blank page. He looked at Camilla with a mixture of curiosity and doubt, as if she were a stranger nearby. He didn't smile, didn't react as before, just maintained a heavy silence between loose words. It was painful to see someone so alive and yet so distant. Camilla cried, unsure if from joy or pain. The doctor entered the room and explained, "He suffered a very severe head trauma. This initial phase of confusion and amnesia is common. He still can't form complete sentences, but it's a positive sign that he's conscious." Camilla listened in silence, trying to hold back her tears. That confirmation didn't erase the feeling that her Pedro was no longer fully there. She continued to hold his hand, as if transmitting love through her touch. She spoke softly, repeating his name and memories that might bring Pedro back. He listened, but responded only with murmurs and vague expressions. There was no smile, no sparkle in the eyes that usually lit up his face. It was as if a piece of his soul had been lost in that accident. Camilla felt she was facing a new challenge. It wasn't enough to save Pedro's life. Now she had to rebuild his memory. A mixture of hope and fear grew within her. As he stood motionless, his gaze lost, she knew the road would be long and painful, but she was willing to fight to the end, no matter the cost. The days following Pedro's awakening were marked by silence and restlessness. Camilla remained by his side, holding his hand as if it could rekindle a lost memory. She repeated his name, talked about wedding details, and showed him photos and small objects from the house. Pedro listened, looked at her, but responded only with small murmurs. It was like trying to talk to someone living in a confused dream. Camilla's every gesture was a silent attempt to reopen a door that seemed closed. She knew Pedro was there, but she also knew that part of him was lost in that labyrinth of erased memories. His words were fragments, disconnected, like distant echoes of who he had been. "I don't know, I don't remember," he said, his voice frail, almost choked. It made her desperate and determined at the same time. Between doctor visits, Camila talked to specialists about therapies and methods to help him. She took notes, recording every reaction, every step forward. The thought of giving up never crossed her mind. To her, Pedro wasn't just her husband. He was the person she wanted to spend her entire life with. And if need be, she would rebuild every memory, every lost smile. Pedro began to react subtly, looking at objects from the house that Camilla had brought. A painting, a mug, even an old photograph stirred fragments of emotion in him. Even though he couldn't recognize their origin, he mumbled incomplete words, trying to make sense of them, his gaze growing increasingly confused. Camilla held onto these small reactions as proof that there was still hope. But frustration also grew. He had moments of restlessness, agony, and even fear. Sometimes he looked at Camilla as if she were a stranger invading his space. It was a cruel blow to her, bearing the weight of losing not only her memory of him, but also the intimacy they had built in such a short time. Still, she didn't turn away. She remained steadfast with unwavering faith and love. Each night before saying goodbye to Pedro, Camilla would lean over him and whisper softly, "I'm here. I always will be." It was a silent prayer, but one filled with power. She knew the battle was just beginning, and while no one could guarantee Pedro would recover everything, she was certain the path would have unexpected twists and turns. Something greater was yet to come. Time seemed to pass slowly in that hospital room. Camilla remained by Pedro's side, bringing him food, talking, and telling him stories about everyday life. He responded with murmurs and small gestures, but without looking directly at her as before. The emotional distance that had emerged was an open wound in her heart. Still, she didn't give up trying to bridge it. Pedro began to exhibit small changes during the visits. Sometimes he seemed to recognize Camilla's scent or tone of voice, but he couldn't connect those moments to a clear memory. He remained silent, staring into space for long minutes. Camilla held his hand and repeated his name as if in prayer, trying to anchor him in the present. It was a daily, intense, and painful effort. Family and friends visited, bringing support and words of comfort. But for Camilla, no one could understand what she was going through. She needed to talk to him, reconstruct a story he couldn't remember. And this task became more difficult every day as Pedro became increasingly withdrawn, as if his mind were a maze with no exit. The nights brought more suffering. Camila would wake with her heart racing, wondering if Pedro would wake up for her that morning. She clung to small hopes, a closer look, a clearly spoken word, an emotional tear, and when nothing happened, she wondered if she could lose the man she loved forever. The doctors explained that this process could take months and that her memory might not fully return, but Camila refused to accept that possibility. She repeated silently every day, "I'll bring you back, Pedro, no matter what." This determination became her strength, and while Pedro remained confused, speaking in slurred, hesitant words, Camilla began to notice something different. A tiny detail, a new reaction she didn't yet understand, something that could change everything. But she didn't know exactly what. And what came next would be even more unexpected. The days in the hospital room dragged by as if time had been suspended. Camilla remained beside Pedro, holding his hand, repeating his name like a prayer. He remained confused, mumbling incoherent words and calling her nurse. She wanted to believe it was just a phase, but the pain in her heart grew with each evasive answer he gave. There were moments when he looked at her with a strange glow, as if trying to remember. Camilla began bringing objects from home to the hospital, small mementos that might rekindle memories in him. A photograph, a mug, even a letter she'd written early in their marriage. She knew everything seemed fragile in the face of this situation, but she had to try. Pedro looked at these objects with curiosity and silence, still unable to connect the dots. Her every gesture was filled with love and despair. The doctors remained cautious. "It's too early to know if his memory will return," they said. Camilla heard these words and tried not to let discouragement take over. She knew this battle wouldn't be won with hope alone, but with persistence. Every day, late in the afternoon, she repeated, "Pedro, I am your wife. We will remember again." These words became her daily prayer. Their relationship began to change in that room. Pedro remained silent for long periods, avoiding eye contact as if defending himself from something he didn't understand. Camilla felt increasingly distant from him, but she refused to back down. Every small sign, however fragile, was a sign of life to her. She was willing to fight for every piece of him. One afternoon, Pedro had an unexpected reaction. He looked at her with a strange expression, touched her hand, and said one clear word, home. Camilla clung to that moment, believing it was a sign. A mixture of joy and anguish filled her chest, but at the same time, she knew she needed to prepare herself for a long road, full of uncertainty. That night, Camilla remained by his side, holding his hand as if it were the last act of love she could offer. Through tears, she whispered stories of their marriage, repeating words she wanted him to remember. Pedro remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, murmuring only a few syllables. Camilla knew the battle was just beginning, and that the worst was yet to come. After weeks of hospitalization, tests, and intense care, Pedro began to show small improvements. His movements were firmer, his eyes more alert, and he began to react to touch. The doctors described it as significant progress, but Camilla knew something was missing. He still couldn't form complete sentences, and his memory remained a blank page. The worst part for her was knowing that her name didn't make sense to him. Camilla spent hours beside him, repeating stories, showing him photos and memories. Her every gesture was a silent attempt to rekindle the past. Pedro watched intently, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He smiled vaguely, as if responding out of politeness, without understanding the depth of it. The silence between them grew, making each moment more painful. Little by little, Pedro began to speak simple but disjointed words. He said house, light, nothing, always oblivious to the faces around him. Camilla listened with a heavy heart, trying to make sense of it. It was as if he were trying to piece together his own puzzle, but missing the most important piece, her. This reality was a silent blow that gnawed at his heart every day. Visits from friends and family became increasingly exciting, but also more difficult. Pedro responded to some of them, recalling fragments of conversations or details of their lives. But when he looked at Camilla, there was only confusion. He treated her kindly, calling her nurse or friend, but the recognition never came. This absence was like an open wound that wouldn't heal. Camilla felt the weight of that struggle growing. Her hope was fueled by small victories, but Pedro's memory of her was a constant pain. She knew she needed to be patient, but her heart begged for answers. Every night before she fell asleep, she would hold his hand and say, "I am Camilla, your wife. No matter how long it takes, I will bring you back." These words were her silent oath. Despite the difficulties, Pedro showed physical and emotional improvements. He smiled more, reacted to sounds, movements, and words. But Camilla knew that overcoming amnesia would be the hardest battle. And she couldn't have predicted that the next phase of this story would bring an even more profound twist, capable of changing everything they imagined about the future. Something was yet to come. As the weeks passed, Pedro showed progress that filled Camilla with hope. He began to sit alone, talk for a few minutes, and respond better to stimuli. The shy smile returned to his face at times, and even short words emerged. But the absence of her memory remained intact, and it weighed like a stone on Camilla's heart. It was like experiencing a marriage in the silence of absence. Pedro still called Camilla nurse, and it broke his heart every day. It was hard to understand that despite his physical recovery, the most precious part of him, his memories, remained lost. She spent hours at his side, repeating his name, recounting details of their wedding, showing him photos and objects from their life. He listened, but her response remained vague and uncertain. His reactions were small victories for Camilla, a longer smile, a lingering look at a photo, a hesitant word, but each step forward was accompanied by a memory that wouldn't return. It was as if Pedro were standing before her, living in the present, but with his history completely erased. This feeling increased her pain and also her determination. The doctors continued to monitor the changes, noting each progress. They said his memory might return, but no one knew when or if it would happen. Camilla held onto every word with hope. For her, the fact that Pedro was alive was already a miracle, but there was a part of her that knew the most difficult challenge was yet to come. Pedro began to display slight confusion, mixing up faces, places, and dates. He called Camilla a nurse even when she explained who she was. He had moments of clarity, but they were brief. Each vague answer increased her anxiety. Camilla understood that the silence wasn't just physical, but also emotional and profound. At night, when the hospital was silent, Camilla would sit beside him and hold his hand. She would speak softly about her plans, about the day he proposed. Pedro listened, but remained silent, as if those words were part of a distant dream. Camilla knew this was only the first battle. The worst was yet to come. It was a quiet morning in the hospital room when Pedro's mother entered. Camilla was beside him, holding his hand, still immersed in worry and hope. As she approached, Pedro opened his eyes with a new light, looking directly at her. A soft smile appeared on his face, and he said emotionally, "Mom!" Camilla fell silent, overcome with amazement. She hadn't expected Pedro to recognize someone so quickly. Pedro's mother, overcome with emotion, came closer, holding his hand tenderly. "Yes, my son, it's me," she said, holding back tears. Pedro closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if holding that memory deeply. The room fell silent, charged with emotion. Camilla, still holding his hand, felt a mixture of joy and fear, knowing his confusion wasn't completely resolved. A few days later, Pedro was discharged. The news brought both relief and anxiety to Camilla. She knew the house would be a new challenge for him, a place filled with faded memories. Pedro's mother insisted on accompanying them, afraid to leave him alone. In the car, silence prevailed until Pedro looked out the window curiously, observing every detail that passed by. When they arrived home, Pedro remained silent for a few minutes. He walked slowly through the rooms, observing furniture, walls, and objects as if for the first time. Then he stopped and looked at his mother, his expression serious and a little confused. "Mom, is this our house?" he asked, his voice hesitant. She tried to answer, but before she could, Pedro continued. Pedro then turned his gaze to Camilla, still holding her hand. His expression was one of doubt and strangeness. "And this girl, who is she? Is she a nurse?" he asked quietly, looking directly at her. Camilla's heart raced. That question was like a blade cutting through her hope, revealing that he didn't remember her or the wedding. The silence in the air grew heavy. Pedro's mother tried to respond, explaining that Camilla was his wife and that she was taking care of him. But Pedro remained silent, frowning in confusion. Camilla held his hand tighter, trying to convey reassurance and love. She knew this was just the first of many battles they would face, and something inside her told her that their story still held secrets capable of changing everything. The silence in the house seemed to weigh like a shadow over everyone. Camilla stood beside Pedro, trying to control her tears. He paced the living room, observing everything with a confused expression, as if trying to understand his own story. His mother remained nearby, silent, holding his gaze with a mixture of sadness and hope. Camilla realized that in that moment an invisible barrier had formed between her and Pedro. Pedro sat down slowly on the sofa, taking a deep breath. He looked at Camilla, his expression uncertain. He wasn't smiling like before, nor was there a sparkle in his eyes. It was as if she were a close, yet strange presence. His words were still hesitant, and the silence carried a painful weight. Camilla took his hand, saying softly, "Pedro, it's me, your wife." But he didn't answer, just looked away. His mother sat beside him, gently touching his hand. "My son Camilla is taking care of you. She's your wife," she said calmly. Pedro remained still, as if absorbing those words, but without a clear reaction. Camilla felt the lump in her throat tighten. That lack of acknowledgement of their love seemed to hurt her deeply. She walked to the kitchen to get water, trying to calm her heart. Each step felt heavy, as if the floor carried the pain of that moment. Pedro watched, still confused, as if trying to comprehend what was happening around him. His mother looked at Camilla, silent, sharing the same anguish. It was a moment filled with tension and pent-up emotions. Pedro stood up suddenly, walking to the window. He stood there for a few minutes, staring at the horizon. Then he turned to his mother and asked again, "Whose house is this?" Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the question wasn't just curiosity, but a clear sign that his memory was still fragmented. It was a chasm between their past and their painful present. At that moment, Camilla sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. She spoke softly, almost like a prayer. "Pedro, let's rebuild our story. I'm here. I won't give up on you." He simply closed his eyes, as if trying to find some lost memory within himself. Camilla knew this struggle was still in its early stages, and something inside her warned her that the worst was yet to come. The next day, Camilla woke with a heavy heart. When she entered the room, Pedro was already sitting up, staring at the ceiling with a distant expression. She approached slowly, feeling fear growing within her. He didn't look at her right away, as if trying to recognize something invisible. Camilla took a deep breath and held his hand, repeating his name gently. Pedro responded with only a hesitant murmur. His voice was weak, as if speaking through a fog. He glanced at her and then dropped his gaze to the ground. Camilla realized that his absence wasn't just physical, but deep and emotional. She knew that rebuilding his memory would be a long and painful journey, and that each day would be a battle. His mother arrived shortly after, wearing a shy smile. She spoke to Pedro affectionately, recalling small moments of his life. But Camilla noticed that Pedro wasn't reacting as he used to. He listened but seemed distant, trapped in a space where memories wouldn't return. It was a scene fraught with tension and sadness. Pedro stood up and began pacing the room slowly, as if searching for something lost. Camilla and his mother exchanged glances, sensing the weight of his uneasiness. He then stopped and spoke softly. "I want to understand. I want to remember." These words echoed in the silence. It was the first time he had expressed a desire to recover his memory. Camilla knew it was a small step forward, but still a sign of hope. Her heart filled with strength to keep fighting. She knew she couldn't give up, even in the face of so much pain. Their battle was just beginning. Before Camilla could say anything else, Pedro looked at his mother and asked again, "And that girl, who is she?" The silence grew thicker. It was a question laden with pain and mystery. Camilla knew that moment would change everything, and that the next chapter of this story held an unexpected twist. The following days were difficult for Camilla. Pedro showed physical progress, but his mind remained distant from her. He remembered his mother, fragments of his childhood, and even old songs, but her name, her face, were too strange. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between them. Camilla realized there was no way back. The pain grew within her. Pedro began to react to small things. A snippet of old music made his eyes sparkle, as if a forgotten flame had been awakened. He smiled slightly, but he didn't recognize Camilla again. She knew this was cruel proof that part of him would never return. In that moment, she held his hand and realized she had to make a painful decision. She couldn't be glued to him for the rest of her life without reciprocity. That late afternoon, Camilla let go of his hand for the first time. The touch was brief, almost symbolic. She felt as if she were letting go not just his hand, but a part of herself. Pedro looked at her with confusion, as if silently asking why. She tried to explain with gentle words, but knew nothing could undo the reality that was imposing itself. Pedro began to wander around the house with slow steps, like someone exploring unfamiliar territory. He looked at every detail with curiosity, but without recognizing the home as his own. Camilla watched from afar, feeling a mixture of sadness and resignation. Her presence beside him became different, more distant, respecting the invisible barrier that loss had built. Pedro's mother, sensing the tension, approached and spoke softly to him. Pedro smiled, immediately recognizing her, and spoke simply about his childhood. Camilla realized in that instant that he had recovered pieces of his past, but not hers. It was a silent, bitter pain that spread in her chest like an unhealing wound. Camilla left the room in silence that night. Before leaving, she looked at Pedro and said softly, "I loved you like I've never loved anyone, but now I need to learn to let go." Pedro remained seated, staring into the void, uncomprehending. She knew this decision would be the hardest part of her life, and something inside her told her their story wouldn't end there. The next morning, Camilla woke with a knot in her chest. The silence of the house seemed to weigh more heavily than the noise of the world outside. She knew it would be another difficult day, but she had to face reality. Pedro was in the living room, sitting silently, staring at an old photograph. There was no recognition in his eyes, only vague curiosity. Camilla felt that every step from then on would be a proof of love and farewell. She entered the room slowly, keeping her distance. Pedro didn't look up at her. Camilla sat in a nearby armchair, watching him silently. His mother stood nearby, smiling tenderly and trying to talk to him. Pedro responded briefly, remembering little stories from his childhood. Camilla felt a pang in her heart. That memory of him no longer included her name. Camilla realized she was in a moment of painful transition. She couldn't maintain the same role in his life. It was a soul-crushing choice, but it was necessary. She let her arm fall to her side, releasing his hand for good. Pedro didn't notice right away, continuing to focus on the stray memories of the past. Camilla knew that this silent separation would mark their lives forever. Pedro's mother noticed the gesture and came over to hold him. He smiled when he saw her, as if finding comfort in that old bond. Camila watched in silence, her tears held back. It was hard to accept that he saw her only as a stranger. She knew that lost memory would never return. It was a cruel reality, but she was beginning to accept it. Pedro stood up and walked over to the piano in the living room. He played a few notes delicately, as if something in the melody spoke directly to his soul. Camila watched every gesture, feeling a mixture of pain and beauty. That was the only bridge that still existed between them, fragments of memories that didn't include her name, and this caused her a silent, profound sadness. Late in the afternoon, Camila decided to step away for a moment. She left Pedro beside his mother and walked to the garden, fighting back tears. Looking up at the sky, she whispered to herself, "True love is sometimes knowing how to let go." She knew that decision would change her life forever, but she also knew she couldn't live clinging to something he no longer remembered. The following days were marked by silence and distance. Camila began to live with the absence of what had once been her world. Pedro was present, but not as before. He lived in small fragments of the past, remembering songs, places, and old moments, but never her. Camila felt a silent ache every time she saw him smile at her mother, but not at her. It was like living next to someone who was already gone. Camila began to reorganize her routine. She spent more time taking care of herself, while watching Pedro rediscover the world around him. He responded emotionally to old songs and small details that brought him comfort, but her absence in his memory remained constant, like an invisible scar. Camila knew that would never change. It was a love that needed to find another form of existence. Their relationship changed profoundly. Pedro accepted his mother's presence, talked to her, and leaned on her. Camila, in turn, learned to respect the space he now occupied in her own memory. She walked beside him tenderly, but without expectation. It was a silent way of remaining present, even without the bond they once shared. A love marked by longing and acceptance. One afternoon, Pedro played the piano again. Camila was in the garden, listening from afar. She knew the melody would no longer include her, but it was part of him. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the feeling take over. It was a silent farewell to everything they had once been. Camila understood that true love doesn't always mean remaining side by side. Pedro looked at her vaguely that afternoon. There was no recognition in his gaze, only curiosity. Camila smiled sadly without tears, as if accepting her fate. She approached, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "I will always love you, even when you don't remember me." He remained silent, playing the music as if it were part of a distant dream. Night arrived, bringing a sense of ending and new beginning. Camila sat alone in her room, holding a photo of them. She took a deep breath, letting the tears fall. She knew she couldn't change his memory, but she could honor the love that existed. And so, closing one painful chapter, she prepared to write another. Something told her the worst was yet to come. Pedro was no longer confined to his hospital bed. He walked around the house with firm steps, supported by his mother, and his communication improved every day. He answered simple questions, laughed easily, and recalled scattered details from the past. But there was something different about him, a distant look in his eyes, as if he carried another soul. Camila realized he was no longer the man she had known. Conversations with Pedro changed. He spoke more clearly, but often lost in fragmented memories. Camila stood beside him, trying to reconstruct a story that now needed to be rewritten. Pedro looked at her as if observing someone for the first time. He smiled, but there wasn't the same intimacy, as if he were getting to know her all over again. Little by little, Pedro began to realize that Camila was always present in his life. He didn't remember the wedding, nor the promises made, but he felt something different about her. It was like a new feeling, a gentle curiosity awakening in his heart. Camila knew he would have to learn to love her again, without memories, without the past. It was a silent battle. Pedro began asking to listen to old songs together, as if trying to reconstruct forgotten pieces. Camila complied, moved, watching him smile with that new innocence. She realized that this new Pedro was willing to know her in a different way. But she knew that rebuilding a love without memory would be their greatest challenge. It took courage to love again. Pedro's mother watched the scene with tears in her eyes. She knew the road would be long. Pedro, even though healthy, was walking toward a new reality, and Camila would be by his side, not as before, but as someone willing to rebuild what time had erased. She held her own hand as if preparing for a new beginning. The house echoed that meaningful silence. That night, Pedro approached Camila and, for the first time, touched her hand with curiosity and tenderness. He didn't say her name, but there was something in his gaze that betrayed intent. Camila smiled softly as if she understood that this gesture was the first step, a step toward rebuilding a love that memory had erased. And she knew this story was still far from over. Pedro was already physically well. He walked around the house confidently, spoke more clearly, and interacted naturally. But in his heart, there was a silent truth. He needed to build a new story. Old memories were erased, and his life was now like a blank page. Camila watched his every step, aware that this was a new beginning. He decided to change. He sought new opportunities and enrolled in a course to learn a new profession. It was as if he wanted to rewrite his future, rebuild his identity. Camila supported him, proud, and at the same time moved. She knew this was his way of starting over and also a way to maintain some connection with her. Pedro dedicated himself to his classes. He was curious, diligent, and determined, like someone seeking something beyond knowledge. Camila perceived a quiet strength in him, born of loss and reconstruction. She knew he didn't remember her, but she also knew that this new Pedro was paving the way for new possibilities. It was a story that needed to be written again. One day, Pedro received an unexpected invitation. An old friend whom he couldn't remember offered him a position in his office. The proposal surprised him, but also sparked enthusiasm. For him, it was another chance to experience something new. Camila saw in his smile the hope of a man willing to start over, even without memories. Pedro accepted the invitation. Camila was moved, watching him take firm steps toward rebuilding his life. It was as if he were rebuilding not only his present, but also a future with her. Despite his memory loss, Pedro demonstrated a desire to move forward. Camila knew this was a decisive chapter for both of them. That night, Pedro and Camila talked at length. He spoke about his plans and dreams as if he were creating a new story. Camila listened attentively, feeling the weight of the story they couldn't yet share in its entirety. She knew their love was being rewritten, and that memory would no longer be the main link. It was a new beginning. Pedro was growing more confident. He had adapted to his new routine and his new job, but something was still missing in his heart, a sense of completeness. Camila could see it in his eyes and gestures. It was as if Pedro was searching for a milestone in the new story they were living, a gesture that symbolized a new beginning. One day, Pedro called Camila over for a chat. He seemed more serious and nervous. During dinner, he held her hand firmly and told her there was something he needed to do. Camila felt her heart race. He was about to turn that chapter into a unique moment, a new page in their story. Pedro then knelt before her. Camila was silent, surprised and moved. He took her hand and said, "Camila, I don't remember that we're already married, but I know I want to build this story with you again." The air became thick, filled with emotion. She felt tears well up in her eyes at such an unexpected gesture. He opened a small box containing a simple yet meaningful ring. "Will you marry me?" Again, he asked with a shy smile. Camila held back tears, overcome with emotion, looking deeply into his eyes. She knew this proposal wasn't just a symbol, but a new promise written in pain and rebuilding. Camila, her voice breaking, replied, "Yes, Pedro, I do, once again." His smile widened, genuine and light, as if in that instant he'd found new hope. It was a moment of new beginnings, where love needed to be rebuilt brick by brick. They were ready to write this new story. Pedro's mother, watching the scene, wept softly. She knew that gesture closed one painful chapter and began another. Camila held the ring, feeling emotion pulse through her heart. She knew this wasn't just a marriage proposal, but living proof that love can be reborn even when all seems lost. And something inside her told her that the next chapter would hold the most intense twist in their story. After the proposal, Pedro seemed lighter, but Camila knew their journey would still be difficult. He was willing to rebuild everything, but that absence in his memory created a silent void between them. Camila watched his every gesture carefully, trying to understand his emotions. It was like experiencing a new love amidst memories that no longer existed. She knew that this moment was delicate. Pedro dedicated himself even more to his new job and his course. It was his way of rebuilding his identity, step by step. Camila saw in him a newfound determination, a genuine will to live. However, there were times when he would lose himself in thought, as if searching for something he couldn't reach. Those pauses carried more questions than answers, and Camilla sensed something was about to change. One night, Pedro came home early from work, seemed restless and thoughtful. He sat next to Camilla, holding her hand in a different way. There were no words in that touch. Intensity, important, something changed lives forever. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Pedro took a deep breath, and he said that even without his memory, he felt he needed to understand more about his life. That something about Camilla touched him deeply, without him being able to explain it. Camilla listened silently, feeling her heart tighten. She knew he was trying to reconstruct something beyond memories, a renewed love. It was a delicate moment, full of emotion. He looked at her intently and said, "Camilla, I want you to know that no matter what memory tells you, I want to love you again every day." Camilla felt tears stream down her face. It was the first time he had expressed that intention so clearly. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft beating of their hearts. That night would mark a turning point. Camilla smiled, overcome with emotion, holding his hand tightly. She knew their journey was just beginning, and in that emotion-laden silence, something seemed to shift. Pedro closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if guarding an invisible promise. Camilla knew this was proof that love, even lost, can be reborn, and something inside her told her the greatest test was about to come. In the following days, Pedro dedicated himself intensely to the new path he was building. He spent hours at work, studying, and trying to create a solid routine. Camilla watched, moved, seeing him grow as a man and as a husband. Even if he didn't remember her, it was a new phase, a forced but also chosen fresh start. She knew their future depended on this rebuilding. Pedro began to talk more about his dreams. He wanted to learn, grow, and understand his place in the world again. Camilla listened, moved, realizing that he didn't just want to rebuild his life. He wanted to build a new story together. But there was something inside her that knew this journey wouldn't be easy. It required courage, patience, and deep love. One silent night, Pedro called Camilla to the garden to talk. He was different, as if he'd made a decision. Looking into her eyes, he held her hands firmly. Camilla could tell he was about to say something important. The silence between them was thick, charged with emotion and anticipation. It was as if something was about to change again. Pedro took a deep breath and said, "Camilla, I want to live all this with you. It doesn't matter if I don't remember. I want to build our story again." She felt her heart race. That sentence wasn't just a request, but a promise. It was a milestone in their new life. Camilla realized that Pedro was, in fact, willing to love again. He knelt before her again, holding her hands. Camilla felt tears stream down her face. Pedro smiled sincerely, as if surrendering his soul. He said, "Will you live this new story with me once more?" Camilla looked deeply into his eyes, feeling that question simultaneously end and begin everything again. With an emotional voice, "Yes, Pedro," together. He smiled, were the only anchor he had. She felt that in that moment pact, rebuilding, of love and of hope, knew that Pedro and celebrate their new commitment yet way. They organized a small, intimate ceremony with very few people, just family and close friends. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, smiles, and suppressed tears. Camilla wore a delicate dress, Pedro an elegant suit. It was a silent reunion where love needed to be rebuilt in front of everyone. That day, Pedro seemed different. His smile was light, as if carrying a new certainty. Camilla watched him tenderly, realizing he was living that moment with genuine intensity. The silence of the ceremony mingled with the guests' emotion. It was a celebration of a new beginning, not just of unity, but of a history recreated. Every glance held weight and promise. Pedro and Camilla exchanged simple but emotionally charged vows. He spoke about the importance of starting over and building something new, even without memories. Camilla wept emotionally, holding his hands tightly. It was as if that moment sealed an invisible promise between them. The ceremony was brief but memorable, a unique chapter in their new story. After the ceremony, their lives began to change. Pedro threw himself wholeheartedly into his work and his coursework, discovering new skills and dedicating himself intensely. Camilla watched with pride at each of his achievements, even though she knew his memory would never return. It was like watching a man being reborn before her. Step by step, a new chapter was forming, full of hope. At work, Pedro soon began to stand out. His dedication and talent attracted attention. He was invited to take on higher positions, a recognition he humbly accepted. Camilla saw in him the transformation of a man rebuilding his path, creating new dreams. It was proof that, even when memories are erased, the spirit can be reborn stronger. That night, Pedro came home smiling. Camilla noticed something different about him. There was confidence in his gaze. He talked about new projects and challenges. She smiled, holding his hand for a moment. She knew that moment was more than a professional achievement. It was living proof that they were writing a new story together, and something inside her told her the best was yet to come. Pedro began taking on new responsibilities at work. He demonstrated leadership, creativity, and determination. Camilla observed each change, realizing he was building a new identity. She knew Pedro wouldn't be the same as before, but that didn't diminish the love she felt. It was a love that needed to be rewritten day after day. Their routine changed completely. Pedro was more confident, engaged, and willing. Camilla noticed he found joy in this new path. She in turn became even more supportive, understanding that they were going through a unique process. It was as if each of his achievements was also a victory for their relationship. At the office, Pedro gained respect and trust. He began receiving invitations to take on larger projects and more important roles. It was recognition, the fruit of his hard work and dedication. Camilla watched it all with pride and emotion. She knew that despite the pain of being forgotten, their lives were taking on new colors. Over time, Pedro began sharing more details of his day with Camilla. He talked about his challenges and victories, demonstrating genuine enthusiasm. Camilla listened attentively, sensing he was building something solid. She understood that this new Pedro needed this support to continue growing. It was a different relationship, but with the same purpose: love. One sunny afternoon, Pedro arrived home with a sparkle in his eyes. He told Camilla about the new job offer he'd received. Camilla smiled excitedly, knowing he was being recognized not only for his work, but for the transformation he was experiencing. It was confirmation that they were both heading towards something greater. That day, Camilla realized Pedro was no longer the man he'd been, but that they were creating something new and beautiful together. He smiled at her with a mixture of tenderness and determination. She held his hand, feeling that moment was a milestone, a chapter where pain and loss were transformed into strength and rebuilding, and something inside them told them that the story still held the most surprising twist yet. It was a sunny afternoon when Pedro and Camilla decided to take a stroll through the park. The day was calm, and the sound of children playing filled the air. Pedro walked beside her, holding her hand, but there was still something different in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and silence. Camilla felt her heart beat faster, as if she sensed something was about to change in that moment. The air seemed to carry an invisible tension. As they walked, Pedro stopped in front of a group of people gathered around a dog. He stared at the animal, his gaze fixed and intense. Camilla noticed a sudden change in his expression, a strange, knowing glow. He approached slowly, looking at the dog with a mixture of tenderness and pain. Camilla felt the weight of that moment in the air. Pedro crouched down, lightly touching the dog, as if touching a forgotten memory. A shiver ran through him and he closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he looked back at Camilla, tears were welling in his eyes. He said in a choked voice, "That dog, he seems so familiar." Camilla held his hand tightly, trying to understand his sudden emotion. Silence fell over the park. Pedro couldn't say much, but his eyes searched for something beyond the present moment. Camilla sensed something profound was happening. He squeezed her hand tighter, as if trying to convey something he couldn't yet express. Her heart raced, sensing they were on the verge of a momentous discovery. Pedro sighed deeply, still looking at the dog. His voice was low, almost a whisper. It was him, my dog. I remember now. Camilla was speechless, tears streaming slowly down her face. She realized that the memory wasn't just about the dog, but about a lost piece of Pedro resurfacing. The silence of the park became charged with emotion and meaning. Pedro held Camilla's hand and said firmly, "I don't remember everything, but this memory is real. He saved my life, and I need to remember everything to live with you again." Camilla wept, overcome with emotion, feeling this was a turning point. It was as if a long-lost door in his memory had been opened. Something profound was about to change in their hearts. In the days following their encounter in the park, Pedro seemed different, as if a forgotten part of him had resurfaced. He spoke little about the dog, could tell he was self, as if a lost door had been cracked open. He sensed they were about to enter chapter. Began to note details more closely. All signs, objects, sound in him a familiar feet. Camila noticed he was more introspective, reflecting deeply on moments he couldn't remember. He began to ask questions about their past frequently, as if trying to fill a deep void. Pain and hope mingled in this new Pedro. One afternoon, as they walked through the city, Pedro stopped in front of a shop window. His gaze lingered, and he sighed deeply. Camila approached and asked what he had seen. He didn't answer immediately, just held her hand tightly. The silence between them said more than words could express. It was as if something very important was about to emerge. Pedro began searching for information about his past. He spent hours talking to his mother and searching through old photos. Camila accompanied him silently, respecting his process. She knew he needed to reconnect every lost piece of his memory. At the same time, she knew this search would bring new challenges and revelations. A mixture of hope and fear hung over them. Their relationship began to change again. Pedro was closer to Camila, but there was a delicate emotional distance. He smiled more, but there were also moments of deep silence. Camila understood that he was fighting an internal battle, not just to remember, but to rebuild trust and love. She knew all of this would take time. One quiet night, Pedro held Camila's hand and said softly, "I want to remember everything, not just the dog, but us." She looked into his eyes, moved, sensing that this was a defining moment. He smiled slightly, but there was a weight in his gaze. It was a promise that even in his loss, he would seek to rewrite his story with her, and something in the air told her that the next chapter would hold an even greater shock. A few weeks later, Pedro seemed even more focused on understanding his past. He spent hours talking to Camila, looking at photos, listening to old songs, and visiting important places. It was as if he were reconstructing his own life piece by piece. Camila followed every step, feeling a mixture of joy and sadness. She knew this journey was changing not only Pedro, but their relationship forever. Pedro began to show profound changes in his behavior. He smiled more spontaneously, hugged Camila more intensely, and showed genuine affection. But at the same time, there were moments of anguish. He would stare into space, as if searching for something within himself. Camila knew those silent pauses carried memories trying to return. It was a silent, intense drama. One day, Pedro suggested they return to the park where he saw the dog. Camila agreed, realizing he needed that moment. Upon arriving, he stood still, staring at the same spot where everything had changed. It was as if searching for signs, hidden answers. Camila felt her heart race. The air was thick with anticipation. Pedro sat on a nearby bench. He held Camila's hand and said, "Something happened here. I feel like I need to remember." Camila looked at him with tears in her eyes. She knew he was about to cross a significant emotional threshold. It was a mixture of pain, hope, and fear. The silence between them said more than any words. As they gazed at the park, Pedro closed his eyes deeply. A memory seemed to surface, slowly, like a flame emerging from the darkness. He spoke in a choked voice. "Camila, I think I know. I remember him. Our dog." She squeezed his hand tightly, feeling an overwhelming emotion. It was the first piece of the past returning. At that moment, Camila realized something was about to change forever. Pedro took a deep breath, as if ready to face the forgotten truth. She felt the weight of their story grow, knowing a major turning point was coming. The air grew thick, as if the next chapter held not only memories, but a twist capable of transforming everything. It was a cool autumn morning when Pedro and Camila decided to take a stroll along a trail near the city. The dry leaves formed a golden carpet on the ground, and the wind blew gently through the trees. The silence of the place seemed inviting reflection. Pedro walked beside Camila, staring intently at the horizon as if searching for something lost. She held his hand carefully, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. Pedro took a deep breath, watching the leaves move in the wind. Camila noticed something different in his gaze. There was a quiet intensity. He seemed to absorb every detail around him, as if memories were trying to emerge. She approached him and asked if everything was okay. He smiled slightly but remained silent for a few moments. It was as if he were preparing to say something important. Pedro spoke softly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I feel something, but I can't explain it." Camila squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of that moment. She knew he was experiencing an inner discovery. The silence between them carried a delicate tension where love and mystery met. It was as if that trail held secrets only they could unravel. In the following days, Pedro seemed different. He talked more about the past, about small sensations and impressions that would emerge unexpectedly. Camila noticed he was increasingly attentive to details. Small gestures seemed to awaken something in him. A smile, a distant look, an incomplete word. She knew he was searching for something very important. One afternoon, Pedro asked to return to the same trail. Camila accepted without hesitation, sensing that the place held meaning. Upon arriving, Pedro stood still, staring at the spot where the sunlight filtered through the trees. A deep silence fell between them, charged with emotion and anticipation. He took her hand and said, "Camila, I think I'm starting to remember us." She felt her heart tighten. The silence grew profound in that instant. Camila embraced Pedro tenderly, sensing that this moment would change everything. She knew they were facing something unique. Pedro closed his eyes, holding her hand tightly, as if trying to preserve that moment forever. She whispered, "Let's remember it together." And something inside them told them that the next chapter held the most important answer. Would he remember everything? It was a golden late afternoon when Pedro and Camila decided to visit a small square near their home. The sky was tinged orange and the wind carried the scent of flowers. They walked in silence, side by side, feeling the weight of the moment. Camila held his hand tenderly, as if to convey strength. Pedro observed everything around him attentively, as if every detail were a lost fragment of his life. Pedro stopped in front of a lighted fountain where the water gently fell. He stared at the movement of the drops, as if something had awakened in his memory. Camila noticed his breathing change, deeper, almost restless. He turned to her and said, "Camila, there's something here that's trying to come back." She smiled, holding his hand tighter, feeling their hearts about to change forever. In the following days, Pedro seemed more present. He tried to talk about the past, showing interest in visiting places they'd been together. Camila noticed that his every gesture carried more emotion. It was as if he were putting together invisible pieces of an ancient puzzle. She knew he was trying to remember, but also to reconstruct their history. The silence was sometimes so intense that it spoke louder than any words. One day, Pedro asked to return to that square at dusk. Camila agreed, knowing the place held something special. Upon arriving, Pedro walked to the fountain and stood in silence. Camila approached, gently touching his hand. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if drifting into a deep memory. Then he spoke softly, "Camila, maybe I'm starting to remember us." Camila's heart raced. She felt hot tears stream down her face, gripping his hand tightly. Pedro opened his eyes and looked at her intently. There was hope, but also doubt in his gaze. It was as if the past and present met in that moment. She knew the question still hung in the air. Would he remember her completely? Pedro smiled softly, squeezing her hand tenderly. Camila responded with a long, silent hug. The sky was slowly darkening, but within them was a renewed light. She knew that even if their memories didn't fully return, they had a new chance. A story built with love, patience, and faith. And for those of you who followed this journey, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it, because stories like these need to be remembered and lived.